Emma Walker dragged her feet along the narrow sidewalk of Savannah, Georgia, her body aching from another endless shift. She worked at the butcher counter in a small grocery store, and every day felt like a battle of endurance. Hours on her feet, lifting heavy cuts of meat, wrapping, weighing, and serving without pause. By the time she clocked out, every muscle in her body screamed for rest. Tonight was no different. She stopped briefly at the checkout, bought a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, and after a moment's hesitation, a whole chicken. Maybe, she thought, she would find the energy to roast it tomorrow. Back at her small apartment, Emma set the bags down on the kitchen table and dropped into a chair. For a long minute, she simply sat there, staring at nothing. Her arms and back throbbed. Her head felt heavy, and even the simple thought of standing again made her wince. She glanced at the trash bin by the counter. It was full, pressing up against the lid. She sighed. The garbage needed to go out. The last thing she wanted was another trip outside. Still, leaving it until morning meant waking up to the smell. With another sigh, half resignation, half irritation, she forced herself up, tied the bag, and carried it to the door. The evening was quiet, the kind of small-town stillness that fell over Savannah once the shops closed and neighbors retreated indoors. Emma walked the short path toward the dumpsters behind her building, the plastic bag digging into her tired hand. As she approached, she slowed. A figure sat, slumped on the bench beside the dumpsters. He was a man unkempt and filthy, his clothes stained, his hair matted, his head bowed low as if the weight of the world pressed down on him. The smell reached her first, sour, damp, unmistakably human neglect. Emma froze, startled. Her first thought was one of irritation. A homeless man, here in her neighborhood. She clicked her tongue under her breath. Of course, she muttered, as if we needed that now. In a city as large as Atlanta, seeing the homeless was common enough. But here, in Savannah's quiet residential streets, where everyone knew everyone, it was almost unheard of. The sight of him sitting there, just feet from her building's entrance, made her skin prickle with unease. What if he carried disease? What if he caused trouble? She shook her head, disgust rising in her chest. She tossed the garbage into the dumpster with more force than necessary and turned on her heel, eager to leave the smell and him behind. But as she passed, something made her glance sideways. Just for a moment, his eyes lifted. They were sunken, ringed with exhaustion, but there was something startling in them, a flicker of depth, of humanity, that didn't match the ragged figure slouched on the bench. Emma's step faltered. She looked away quickly, muttering under her breath, and hurried back toward the stairs. Inside her apartment, she leaned against the door after locking it, pressing her palms against the wood. Why did his eyes linger in her mind? She shook her head, telling herself it was nothing, just exhaustion playing tricks. But as she sat back down at her kitchen table, she couldn't shake the feeling. Who was he? And how had someone like that ended up here, in her small corner of Georgia? The answer lay not in Savannah's quiet streets, but years earlier in another life, before the man had lost everything. His name was Jacob Reed, and once he had been someone entirely different. Years before Emma ever crossed paths with him, Jacob Reed had been a man whose life seemed set for greatness. Born into a modest family in Georgia, with a father who worked long hours in construction and a mother who juggled housekeeping with a part-time job, Jacob grew up knowing that nothing in life came easily. While his older brother followed their father into labor, Jacob's heart was elsewhere. From a young age, numbers fascinated him. Equations, chemical formulas, the quiet thrill of solving problems. Those were his companions long before he stepped foot into a lecture hall. At Georgia Tech, he earned his place not through privilege, but through determination. He supported himself by tutoring, repairing old appliances, even writing lab reports for classmates who lacked his discipline. Nights often found him hunched over textbooks under the harsh glow of library lights, his stomach empty but his mind ablaze. Professors noticed his brilliance, his restless curiosity, and by the time he completed his degree, the university offered him a position as a junior lecturer. For Jacob, that opportunity was more than a job. It was proof that his sacrifices meant something. He thrived in the classroom, his passion infectious, his research innovative. He secured a patent on one of his early projects, a device that brought him recognition and a measure of financial independence. By his late 20s, he had purchased a small apartment, furnished it carefully, and for the first time, allowed himself to dream of a family. That dream seemed to take form the day he met Lily. She was a new hire at the university, a young instructor with a quick mind and a smile that lit every room. Their connection was immediate, the kind of spark that left no room for hesitation. Within months, they were living together. Within the year, they married. Their love was fierce, their hopes high. Jacob wanted children, a bustling home filled with laughter. Lily wanted the same, but fate was cruel. Twice, Lily miscarried. Each loss hollowed them, left Jacob clinging tighter, trying to be strong for both of them. Still, they pressed on, telling themselves that time would heal. Then came the diagnosis. The disease struck fast, merciless. Doctors spoke in hushed voices, but the truth was clear. There would be no recovery. Lily's health declined rapidly, and within months she was gone. Her death shattered Jacob. The apartment that had once been filled with light turned into a tomb of silence. He stopped showing up to his lectures. Research projects gathered dust. Colleagues tried to reach him, but he brushed them aside. For a time, the department tolerated his absences. He was, after all, one of their brightest minds. But brilliance could not excuse disappearance. Eventually, the administration had no choice but to release him. By then, Jacob no longer cared. Without Lily, everything felt pointless. He withdrew from his family, ignoring calls, ignoring visits. His parents, frantic, searched for him when he vanished altogether. They arrived at his apartment only to find it abandoned. The once orderly space left in disarray, the atmosphere heavy with despair. Days of searching turned into weeks. When their efforts brought nothing, they filed a missing person report. The trail went cold. Jacob Reed disappeared into the margins of society. The once celebrated academic faded from view, trading lecture halls for back alleys, the respect of colleagues for the indifference of strangers. And it was in this broken state that Emma Walker would one day find him, slumped beside a dumpster in Savannah, unrecognizable from the man he once was. The following week, life at the grocery store pressed on as usual. Emma worked the counter with her colleague Donna Price, who was quick to chatter as they scrubbed down their stations. Donna glanced at Emma with a knowing smirk. "You've got it easy," she said. "No husband, no kids, just yourself to take care of. Must be nice." Emma smiled faintly, unwilling to share the ache she carried, the yearning for a family of her own. She kept her thoughts to herself, unaware that the man she had dismissed days earlier would soon alter the course of her quiet life. It was late in the evening when Emma turned the corner onto her street, her grocery bag tucked under one arm, her mind already drifting toward the comfort of bed. The autumn air in Savannah was cool, heavy with the scent of damp leaves, the kind of night when most of the town had already settled behind drawn curtains. She longed for silence, for stillness. But as she neared her building, she slowed. There he was again, the same man she had noticed by the dumpsters days earlier, Jacob Reed. He sat hunched on the bench just outside her apartment complex, head bowed, body folded in on itself as though he were trying to disappear into the night. Emma's chest tightened. She considered crossing to the other side of the street, avoiding him altogether. What business of hers was it if some drifter chose to haunt her block? She shook her head, muttering under her breath, and kept walking. But as she drew level with the bench, movement caught her eye. Jacob shifted, then faltered. His body tilted as though the bench itself had betrayed him, and before Emma could react, he nearly collapsed to the ground. A strangled sound escaped his lips, weak, barely audible. Emma froze. Every instinct urged her to keep going. He wasn't her responsibility. She had her own problems, her own exhaustion, but something rooted her in place. She stared at the crumpled figure, his chest rising and falling with difficulty, his skin pale beneath the grime. This wasn't drunkenness, she realized. This was something else, something worse. Her heart thudded painfully. She took a hesitant step closer. "Hey," she said softly, almost against her will. "Are you okay?" His eyes fluttered open, and for the briefest second they met hers. There was no hostility there, no madness, only pain. He gave the slightest nod, as if admitting the truth cost him the last shred of strength he had. Emma's throat tightened. She should walk away. She should call someone else. But her phone was nearly dead, the screen dark, and the thought of leaving him sprawled on the sidewalk gnawed at her. Cursing under her breath, she crouched beside him. "Come on," she whispered. "Let's get you up." With effort, Jacob allowed her to help. His body was alarmingly light, as though every ounce of muscle had wasted away. Step by shaky step, she guided him through the entryway, up the short flight of stairs, and into her apartment. She eased him onto the couch, her breath quick, her palms damp with nerves. Her phone flickered to life after she plugged it in. Hands trembling, she dialed 911. Within minutes, the wail of a siren pierced the night, and EMTs climbed the stairs, their presence filling her small living room. They examined Jacob swiftly, their flashlights and medical bags turning the space into a temporary clinic. The diagnosis was clear: severe malnutrition, exhaustion, dehydration. Nothing immediately life-threatening, but enough to explain his collapse. They urged him to come with them, to be admitted for further care. But Jacob shook his head firmly, his voice hoarse yet determined. He signed the AMA form against medical advice, refusing hospitalization. Emma stood by, her arms crossed tightly against her chest, torn between relief and unease. Relief that it wasn't worse. Unease that he would be staying here in her apartment, even if only for the night. When the EMTs packed up and left, the silence that followed was deafening. Emma leaned against the kitchen counter, staring at the figure slumped on her couch. His breathing was shallow, his eyes closed, his face gaunt yet strangely peaceful in the dim light. Somewhere deep inside, Emma knew the truth. By helping him inside, by calling for help, by refusing to walk away, she had crossed an invisible line. This man was no longer a stranger on a bench. For better or worse, she had let him into her world. And as she stood there, staring at him, the weight of that choice settled heavily on her shoulders. The apartment was quiet after the EMTs left, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound. Emma lingered by the kitchen counter, still uncertain. She had carried Jacob in on impulse, but now what? He was too weak to leave, and she couldn't imagine simply putting him back on the street. She glanced toward the couch. His eyes were half open, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to adjust himself against the cushions. A surge of pity swept over her, pushing back the irritation that had first flared when she saw him by the dumpsters. Emma turned toward the stove. She had a pot of chicken soup from the day before, nothing fancy, just broth, vegetables, and bits of meat. She warmed a bowl and carried it to the couch, setting it on the coffee table. Pulling a chair close, she sat down and lifted the spoon. "Here," she said gently, holding it toward him. Jacob shifted, his gaze dropping to the steaming bowl. Slowly he shook his head. His voice was rough but firm. "Please, I can do it myself." Emma blinked, surprised. She expected him to be too weak to resist, but there was pride in his tone, something unbroken. With visible effort, he pushed himself upright, his hand trembling as he reached for the spoon. She hesitated, then let him take it. His fingers closed awkwardly around the handle, and he began to eat, slowly, carefully. It was clear the soup brought him relief. His shoulders relaxed slightly, and for the first time since she had seen him, there was a trace of peace in his expression. When the bowl was nearly empty, he set the spoon down and leaned back, exhausted. "Thank you," he murmured. Then, after a pause, he looked at her with an expression that was almost apologetic. "I'm sorry for being here, for troubling you. I'll rest a little and then I'll go. I don't want to cause you any inconvenience." Emma's lips parted, but no words came at first. She had expected bitterness, entitlement, or silence. Instead, his voice was measured, his manner courteous. It startled her. This was not the way most people imagined a homeless man would speak. "You don't need to apologize," she managed. "You're not well. Just stay put for now." He nodded faintly, closing his eyes for a moment. Emma rose, restless. Something about his voice, the careful way he formed his words, had unsettled her in a way she couldn't explain. On impulse, she walked to her closet and pulled out a duffel bag tucked on the top shelf. Inside were old clothes her younger brother had left during his visits, jeans, shirts, even a razor kit. She carried it back to the living room and set it near the couch. "Here," she said quietly. "There are some clean clothes. And a razor if you want. The bathroom's down the hall." Jacob's eyes opened, and for the first time, she saw embarrassment flicker across his face. He looked down at his own grimy hands, at the tattered sleeves of his shirt. "That's generous of you," he said softly. Emma didn't reply. She simply gestured toward the hallway. Slowly, he pushed himself to his feet. His movements were unsteady, but he waved off her instinct to help. "I can manage," he insisted. She let him go, watching as he disappeared into the bathroom. The sound of running water filled the apartment. Emma sat back down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her mind racing. Part of her whispered that this was dangerous. She didn't know this man. He could be anyone, a criminal, a thief. What if she was being foolish? But another part of her, the part that had made her stop on the sidewalk and lift him up, couldn't let go of the truth she had seen in his eyes. He was broken, yes, but not beyond saving. Minutes later, the bathroom door creaked open. Jacob stepped out wearing her brother's clothes. They hung a little loose on his thin frame, but he looked transformed. His hair, once matted, was combed back. The beard that had obscured his face was gone, replaced by clean-shaven skin. He looked younger, and though still gaunt, there was no mistaking the quiet dignity that lingered beneath the exhaustion. Jacob shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. "Thank you," he said again, his voice low. "For the meal. For this. I'll repay you somehow when I can." Emma studied him, torn between suspicion and something else she couldn't name. She gave a small nod. "Just rest. That's enough for now." And as he lowered himself back onto the couch, the fragile beginning of trust settled between them. Uncertain, delicate, but real. The days that followed settled into a strange rhythm. Emma found herself doing things she never imagined she would. Cooking extra portions, setting aside medicine, and checking on the man who now occupied her couch. At first, it felt awkward, like she was hosting a stranger who might vanish at any moment. But each morning when she left for work, Jacob was still there, quiet, weak, but slowly regaining strength. The EMTs had left instructions before they departed that night. Electrolyte fluids, vitamins, light meals to rebuild his strength. Emma took their words seriously. On her way home from the store each evening, she stopped by the pharmacy aisle, picking up bottles of supplements and electrolyte packets. At the counter, she bought fresh vegetables, bread, milk. Preparing meals no longer felt like a chore done for herself alone. It carried a new purpose. Still, not everyone saw it that way. At work, Donna Price raised her eyebrows when Emma mentioned the man staying in her apartment. "Emma, are you out of your mind?" she asked one afternoon as they cleaned their knives at the butcher counter. "You don't know him. He could be dangerous, a thief or worse, and you just let him into your home." Emma bristled, focusing on scrubbing the cutting board. "He was sick, Donna. I couldn't just leave him on the street." Donna scoffed. "That's how people get themselves hurt. You think the world runs on good intentions. Wake up. You've worked too hard to lose everything to some drifter." Emma didn't answer. She had no defense beyond the truth she felt in her gut. that walking away had never been an option. Still, Donna's words lingered. That night, as she walked home through the quiet streets, doubts crowded in. Was she being naive? Foolish? She'd barely had enough for herself, and now she was sharing with a man she hardly knew. But when she opened the door and saw Jacob sitting upright, waiting with a tentative smile, the weight of those doubts loosened. He had shaved again, his posture straighter. Though still thin, his eyes were clearer than before. "Good evening," he said softly, his voice steadying a little more each day. "How was work?" The question startled her. It was the kind of thing friends asked, not a man who had collapsed outside her building. She shrugged. The usual. Long loud. He nodded, listening, as if the details of her day actually mattered. Later, over dinner, he began to speak of himself. At first, it came in fragments. A mention of teaching. A reference to a wife named Lily. His voice carried both warmth and sorrow, like he was turning over fragile glass in his hands. Emma listened, her heart tightening. He told her about meeting Lily at Georgia Tech, about the joy of their early years, about the devastating miscarriages. His eyes clouded when he spoke of Lily's illness, the speed with which it took her, the helplessness of watching her fade. His words faltered, but Emma filled the silence with patience, letting him continue when he was ready. When he admitted that he had lost everything afterward, his job, his will to live, his place in the world, Emma felt a lump rise in her throat. She imagined the lecture halls, the students who once looked to him with respect, an empty apartment that had become a monument to grief. "I wasn't strong enough," Jacob whispered. "I thought I could handle it, but when she was gone, it was like the ground disappeared beneath me." Emma reached for her glass of water, her hands trembling slightly. She wanted to tell him he was wrong, that surviving such loss wasn't weakness. But the words caught in her throat. All she could manage was a quiet, "I'm sorry." Jacob gave a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "So am I." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was weighted, fragile, but it carried something new, an understanding that went beyond words. Emma realized then that what connected them wasn't pity. It was recognition. She had spent years longing for someone to care for, someone to build a life with, while he had lost precisely that. Somehow, their broken pieces seemed to fit together in ways neither of them had expected. And though the world outside would never understand, within the walls of Emma's small apartment, a fragile connection had begun to take root. Weeks passed, and with each one, Jacob grew stronger. The hollows beneath his eyes softened, his shoulders straightened, and he began moving around Emma's apartment with more certainty. At first, it was small things, folding the blanket he had used on the couch, rinsing his own dishes after meals. But soon, Emma noticed him sweeping the kitchen floor, fixing a loose cabinet door, even changing a flickering light bulb without being asked. "You don't have to do that," she told him one evening when she came home to find the trash already taken out. Jacob only smiled faintly. "I want to. You've done enough for me. Let me give something back." Despite his gratitude, a quiet tension began to grow. One night, as they sat across from each other at the kitchen table, Jacob cleared his throat. "Emma, I think it's time I left." The words landed heavily, and she set down her fork. "Left? Where would you go?" He looked down, ashamed. "Anywhere. I've taken too much already. You don't owe me this roof, this food. I was never meant to stay." Emma's chest tightened. She should have expected this moment. But the thought of her apartment without him suddenly felt unbearable. He had filled a space in her life she hadn't realized was empty until now. She shook her head. "Jacob, you're not a burden. You're," she faltered, searching for the right word. "You're part of this place now, at least to me." His eyes softened, but he didn't argue further. Not long after, Emma found herself doing something she had considered before but never acted on. Reaching out. She tracked down a phone number tucked inside a weathered notebook Jacob had carried but never used. It belonged to his parents, The call was hesitant, her voice trembling as she introduced herself. When they arrived days later, the reunion was overwhelming. His mother clung to him as though afraid he might vanish again, tears streaking her face. His father, a man hardened by years of labor, broke down openly in the small apartment, gripping Jacob's shoulders as if anchoring him to the world again. Gratitude poured from them, directed at Emma, who stood quietly to the side, unsure how to respond. "You brought our son back to us," his mother whispered, pulling Emma into an embrace. "We thought we'd lost him forever." For Jacob, that day became a turning point. Surrounded by the warmth of family, something inside him shifted. The fog of despair that had weighed him down for years began to lift. That evening, as the four of them sat together, he spoke of returning to research, not for money, not for recognition, but because it had once given him purpose. "I can't waste this second chance," he said firmly. "Lily would never have wanted that." Emma watched him, pride welling up in her chest. She had seen him at his lowest, broken and hollow, and now here he was, choosing to stand again. In the months that followed, Jacob rebuilt piece by piece. He reconnected with colleagues, revisited old projects, and spent long nights poring over research materials Emma helped him find. The spark that once defined him slowly returned, illuminating the man beneath the scars of grief. Through it all, Emma remained by his side. What had begun as obligation transformed into something deeper. She realized at the night he repaired the old clock that had belonged to her grandmother. He set it on the shelf, hand steady now, and when he looked up at her, she felt a rush of warmth she could no longer deny. He must have felt it too, because his gaze lingered, soft and steady, before he finally spoke. "Emma, I never thought I could feel this again." Her heart answered before her voice did. "Neither did I." A year after the night she first carried him into her apartment, Emma walked down the aisle of a small church in Savannah. Jacob stood waiting, dressed in a simple suit, his expression one of awe. Their vows were quiet, intimate, but heavy with the weight of all they had endured. When they exchanged rings, it wasn't just a union of two people. It was a promise born of loss, survival, and the courage to start again. The seasons turned, and with them came a new chapter Emma had long dreamed of but never dared to believe possible. In the springtime, she gave birth to a son, a boy with Jacob's steady eyes and her own warm smile. They named him Caleb. From the moment she held him in her arms, Emma felt a completeness she had yearned for her entire adult life. The sleepless nights, the long feedings, the exhaustion that tugged at her bones, it all melted in the face of Caleb's soft breathing, his tiny fingers curling tightly around hers. Jacob was no less transformed. Where once despair had ruled his days, now it was joy. He held his son with reverence, as though every moment were sacred. Friends and family often caught him studying the baby's face, overcome by the miracle of it. For a man who had thought all chance of family was lost, Caleb was proof that hope could return even after devastation. As the months passed, Jacob threw himself back into work. With Emma's encouragement, he reached out to his old colleagues in Atlanta, re-establishing ties that had long frayed. His reputation, though scarred by his years of absence, had not been forgotten. Slowly, he was welcomed back into the world of research. Soon, his projects were once again producing results, and one of his innovations drew the attention of investors. For the first time in years, steady income returned, not just enough to survive, but enough to plan for a future. Emma, too, began to reclaim dreams she had buried. With Jacob's insistence and support, she left her job at the grocery store. The butcher counter that had consumed her youth no longer defined her. Instead, she enrolled at a local college, finally chasing the education she had once thought out of reach. Walking onto campus as a student, books in hand, she felt the thrill of possibility spark inside her. Their lives shifted quickly. With Jacob's research providing financial stability, they bought a modest but spacious home on the outskirts of Savannah, a white house with a porch shaded by oaks, a place where Caleb could play in the yard. Moving day was chaotic and joyful, their small family laughing as they unpacked boxes late into the night. For Emma, standing in the doorway of their new home, it was the embodiment of everything she had longed for. Not just shelter, but a true sanctuary. Even as she studied and cared for Caleb, Emma found herself pulled towards something more. The memory of Jacob slumped outside her building never left her, nor did the countless faces she now noticed on Savannah streets, men and women who carried the same hollow look he once had. She began volunteering at a shelter downtown, first serving meals, then organizing clothing drives. Soon, her involvement deepened. She spoke to community groups, advocating for compassion, reminding them that homelessness was not a life choice but often the result of heartbreak and misfortune. Jacob supported her every step of the way. In the evenings, when Emma returned from her classes or her volunteer work, he listened intently as she shared the stories she had heard. He never forgot his own journey, and together they resolved that their family would not only live for themselves, but also for others who needed a second chance. Their days were full, sometimes exhausting, but always meaningful. Caleb grew quickly, his laughter echoing through the house, filling every corner with life. On weekends, the three of them strolled through Forsyth Park, Jacob pushing the stroller while Emma walked beside him, their hands brushing together. They spoke of the future, of siblings for Caleb, of new research Jacob hoped to publish, of the degree Emma would soon earn. There were no illusions that life would always be easy. But for Emma and Jacob, the hardships of the past had forged something stronger than certainty: resilience. They had walked through grief and despair, and together they had chosen to build again. And in the glow of their new home, surrounded by love and purpose, they knew their story was not one of tragedy anymore. It was one of rebirth. 6 years slipped by like pages turning in a well-loved book. Life for the Reed family had blossomed in ways that once felt impossible. Jacob's work in science was not only restored, but thriving. His renewed research had earned recognition again, and though he carried the scars of his lost years, those scars no longer defined him. They reminded him of what had been rebuilt. Conferences, collaborations, published papers, all returned, but this time Jacob balanced them with something greater: the quiet joy of fatherhood and the steady presence of Emma. Emma, too, had transformed. The woman who once trudged home from the butcher counter exhausted and alone was now a college graduate, a community advocate, a wife, and a mother. Her days were full, but never empty. Between raising Caleb, supporting Jacob, and running outreach programs for the homeless in Savannah, she had become known not only as Jacob Reed's wife, but as a woman in her own right, a voice of compassion in their town. Caleb grew in the middle of all this love, his childhood bright and secure. He was a curious boy, always asking questions, forever tugging at Jacob's sleeve for explanations about the stars, about the way plants grew, about anything that caught his imagination. His laughter echoed through their house, filling it with life, a constant reminder of how far they had come. The community had taken notice, too. Stories spread of the family, whose beginning was stranger than fiction. The Miracle family, neighbors called them with affection. Everyone in Savannah seemed to know how Emma had found Jacob slumped by the dumpsters that night, how she had brought him inside, how that single act had changed everything. In a town where gossip traveled fast, theirs became a story not of scandal but of hope, a tale retold in churches, schools, and local gatherings as proof that kindness still mattered. One crisp autumn morning, Emma and Jacob walked hand in hand down the sidewalk, Caleb skipping a few steps ahead with his backpack bouncing against his shoulders. It was his first day at a new grade, and excitement radiated from him. The sun filtered through the Spanish moss hanging from the oaks, casting a golden glow over the quiet street. At the school entrance, Caleb turned and waved. "Bye, Mom." "Bye, Dad." His grin was wide, his eyes alight with confidence. Jacob knelt to adjust the strap of his son's backpack one last time, pressing a quick kiss to his hair, while Emma brushed a hand across Caleb's cheek. Then, with one final glance, the boy darted toward the building, joining the stream of children filing inside. From the window, his teacher paused, watching the family. She smiled to herself, struck by the tenderness of the moment. She had heard whispers of their story, the way Jacob had fallen, the way Emma had lifted him, and seeing them now, standing side by side, it felt like witnessing a miracle in motion. As the school doors closed behind Caleb, Emma slipped her arm through Jacob's. They lingered a moment on the sidewalk, neither in a hurry to leave. The air was filled with the ordinary sounds of a morning. Car engines, children's chatter, but for them it was layered with memory. Jacob squeezed her hand. "Do you remember that night?" Emma didn't need to ask which one. The dumpster, the collapse, the decision to stop instead of walk away. Those images would never leave her. She nodded. "I do. I remember thinking I was crazy bringing you home." He chuckled softly, his eyes glistening. "Maybe you were, but it saved me." Emma leaned her head against his shoulder, her voice quiet. "It saved me too." They stood there, side by side, letting the years between then and now wash over them. The loneliness, the grief, the fear, all of it had led here, to a family, to love, to a life neither of them had dared to hope for. As they turned toward home, the lesson of their journey was clear, not only to them, but to all who knew their story. Sometimes a single choice could alter the course of a life. Sometimes the smallest act of compassion could light a path through the darkest night. And for Emma and Jacob, that truth had become their legacy. In the end, theirs was not a story about tragedy, though it had begun there. It was a story about what could grow from ashes when kindness was offered freely. A reminder that even in the quiet corners of a small southern town, miracles could unfold, not with spectacle, but with simple, steadfast love. Kindness had saved one life, then two, and in time, it had created a family. And that, more than any invention or accolade, was proof that miracles were real,